Okay, we're recording now. Rivera Sun, she's written a couple books. I'll kind of like show you one or two of them. You may be acquainted, you may have read some of them, and I don't even have all of them on hand. But she's been pretty darn busy over the years. And yeah, I think there's like three or four, maybe four or five more that I don't even have in my office here. But she's a creative genius, as you all know, because you're here. I'm Tom Hastings, and I teach at Portland State University, and am lucky enough to know Rivera Sun through the James Lawson Institute and ever after. So we are recording now, and Rivera Sun, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for hosting this call, organizing it, offering it up to your students, and challenging me to do the research on these topics. I learned so much in this process, and for many of you know this about me, but I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to these stories of civil resistance. I love them. I collect them. And so I am just so excited to get to know some other ones, to get outside of the usual kind of toolbox of stories that I look at. And there are more stories than we think. We have more power than we think, is a key takeaway for today. But let's do a little poll to start with, and then we'll poll again later on today. So if you could put into the chat box, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being completely impossible and 10 being absolutely possible, how possible do you think it is for ordinary people like us to stop war? Any answer is fine. 1 is completely impossible, 10 is absolutely possible. Some 10s coming in, some 8s, some 10s. Oh, great, some 4s. Thank you for your honesty. Sometimes I feel that way too. Yeah, it feels like a 1. So some days definitely feel like a 1 for me. 6, 3, 9. Okay, so we've got a range in here. Good to know. We'll check in again at the end of the session. I'll see if I've changed any of your minds, but I think you're not alone. No matter where you ended up on that spectrum, we all have these questions about what can we do when war is happening or brewing or about to break out. And I hope today will give you a few ideas, if not all the answers. So let me share my screen. So just to give you an overview of what we'll talk about today, so you get a sense of the landscape that we're going to cover, we're going to look at ways that nonviolent action or civil resistance has prevented war from breaking out, stopped it when it was brewing. We're also going to look at how it has replaced war, which is the ultimate prevention. So how are people waging struggle in ways that mean that they didn't have to have a civil war or an armed uprising? How have people used tools of strikes and boycotts and non-cooperation to win the war, quote unquote, or to advance the cause of justice without resorting to the violence that is happening around them? We're also going to look at ways that people have carved out space for peace amidst war, and the new research that shows how critically important that is. And then the piece that is really often we think about in this category of stopping wars is how have people pushed for an end to war, especially when it's entrenched and seems to be getting nowhere. Nobody's going to win except a lot of people are going to die. But even that is not enough, because we don't finish this conversation unless we talk about how we can ongoingly dismantle pieces of the war machine and build long-lasting nonviolent infrastructure for security and defense. Because this brings you back full circle to the first thing that I mentioned, preventing war. We want to be doing all of these things as peace activists at every stage of every conflict that can possibly arise. So a little couple of disclaimers. We don't have all the answers. I think it's very tempting to come to a talk like this and hope that you're going to get a cookie cutter explanation for what, how we can solve the problems, particularly the war-related problems we're facing right now. The truth is, none of us have all the answers. There's a lot of inventiveness, but hopefully you'll leave with more ideas about how to do this than when you started. Further research on this is needed. That was really made clear to me as I did research for this. Tonight is going to be an introduction to these ideas, and we could study them so much more deeply. But I think you should be heartened to find out that there are far more examples than we think. That when I started this research, I thought of 3 examples. Tom suggested 2 more. There's going to be at least 30 tonight. But one thing to know about this particular set of stories of civil resistance is that there are often multiple narratives around each struggle. When a war is waged and then it ends, oftentimes politicians like to claim that they stopped the war, or diplomats, or the military even. Or some military says, I want to say I won. Another one says we lost. The stories I'm going to tell tonight may not be the only narratives that you have heard of these struggles, but it is a piece of the story that you definitely need to know. There are some differences between some of these struggles and what I might call peacetime struggles. We'll talk a little bit about that. But let's dive right in. The first category I want to look at is this idea of replacing war. Because anytime people choose to use nonviolent struggle instead of picking up guns, weapons, tanks, and bombs, they have stopped a war by choosing the alternative. I see these stories all the time in my capacity as the editor of Nonviolence News. I collect 30 to 50 stories of nonviolent action in action around the world. And people are doing incredible things. They're changing their constitutions, they're overthrowing dictatorships, they're winning rights and freedoms. And every single one of these struggles, people could have chosen to pick up guns and try to achieve their aims. Instead, they've picked up boycotts, protests, marches. So the greatest forward advancement in the peace movement is happening every single time that some group of people decides to march, protest, boycott, go on strike. And we should notice that. Noticeably, there were some dramatic examples of this recently. Bolivia in 2019 had a contested election, a little bit like ours in 2020, except the right wing won. So the right wing cast doubt on the election. They held violent protests in the streets about it. They got the military generals to back their cause, and the military generals threatened a coup of the sitting president, Evo Morales, who had to then flee the country. This would have been a coup of the right wing, but it wasn't the end of the story, because the Bolivian people took to the streets en masse by the millions. Through the course of a year, they shut down roads, they went on strike, they coordinated general strikes, they put up roadblocks, and their demand was to rehold the elections and to have them more verifiable and certifiable than the last ones. A year later, 16 months later, they achieved that goal against tremendous repression and elected a left-wing government, kicking the right wing out of power. This is an example of how people have replaced the use of armed uprisings with nonviolent civil resistance. We also saw this in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when nations like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had nonviolent uprisings, nonviolent revolutions to gain their independence from the Soviet Union. And it's a field that gives us a lot of hope, and it should. The Zapatistas, who were not originally a nonviolent movement, they were an armed uprising, although they've had several chapters of their organizing in Mexico. They, in 2021, invaded, quote unquote, Spain in protest of colonialism, to say to the Spanish people, to show to the Spanish people how ridiculous it was that the Spaniards 500 years ago came to Mexico, planted their flag, and said, I claim you in the name of Spain. So they did a mock invasion where they sailed the ship up to the beach, they got off and they stuck a flag in the ground of Spain and said, "We claim you for the Zapatistas." Now, if they had done this carrying guns, the Spanish army would have come out and violently ejected them from the shore of Spain. Instead, they chose to do it as a nonviolent campaign and held marches, rallies, symbolic demonstrations, talks, lectures, teach-ins, and succeeded in their goal of calling the bluff on colonialism. Other examples of this might include the Maori land occupations. There's been many of them. You're looking at one that has occurred where they are using nonviolent occupations to reclaim land that was taken from them illegally by the New Zealand government. They have succeeded in reclaiming several parcels of land using these nonviolent tactics. And indeed, Indigenous people deserve a very special mention for the choice to defend and assert their sovereignty as sovereign nations, predominantly in this stage of history, using nonviolent tactics. In the case of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, which is up against a corporate state collusion between the Coastal Link gas pipe and the nation of Canada, this is an example of a time when they could have chosen to arm up, to get guns, to go murder the pipeline workers, to fight an all-out bloody battle with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Instead, they chose to set up a blockade, a barrier, to call upon other nations to blockade railroad tracks in support of them. And this struggle continues. But in order to see this, you have to give First Nations their full sovereignty back in your mind, to understand that this is similar to if Mexico invaded the US trying to build a pipeline, right? When you understand that this is a nation-to-nation, state-to-state conflict that one of the states is waging with nonviolent struggle, it is a powerful bit of peace history that is often, or peace studies that is often overlooked. Okay, let's do a little check-in because I'm going to talk a lot tonight, but I want to make sure I hear from you. Can you put into the chat box one word that comes to mind as you hear these stories? What is one word that's coming to mind as you listen? All right, hope, courage, creativity, affirmation, faith, wow, persistence, solidarity, legacy, inspiration, organization, bravery. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of that. So let's go to the next piece of this equation. Let's look at how people have used this. Oops, let's not look at that screen. Hold on a minute while I pull up my other notes. Here we go. Much better. So let's look at how people have prevented war using nonviolent resistance. This is when a war is brewing. You can hear the warmongers rattling their chains. The politicians are grandstanding and making threats. The troops are amassing on the borders. Maybe even a little bit of violence has broken out. Here's how people have stopped that scenario. Let's talk about Algeria. Oh, Algeria, how I love these stories. So Algeria was a colony of France for a long time. And they had a bloody war of independence. This was not nonviolent at all. Incredibly, excruciatingly brutal. First of all, towards the end of the war, right when France was about to release Algeria and give them their independence, the military generals staged a mutinous coup against Charles de Gaulle and threatened to overthrow the government of France in Paris and take over Algeria again. This was thwarted by nonviolent campaigns in both Algeria and in France that resisted the coup and stopped them from succeeding. That story alone would be impressive enough, but that's not the end of Algeria's saga. So Algeria then gets its independence, and two factions come to power, and they start squabbling, as factions do. And their attempts to rule in their Congress parliament start to disintegrate. And they start to, because they all have arms and weapons, they launch a civil war against each other. But the people have already gone through 7 years of war and they're not having it. So they go and they stand in front of tanks. They lay down in front of troops. They blockade military bases and they stop this civil war from breaking out. So this was significant also because violence was happening. Over 1,000 people actually died during this effort to stop this civil war. So it would have been so easy to fall into retaliatory cycles of violence, saying, oh, well, they killed these people, so now we have to go kill them. But no, the people of Algeria, by and large, were clear. They were like, this is not the solution. We've had enough of this violence, and we need to have a nonviolent, peaceful, civil government. And that's what they pushed for and ultimately won. A recent example, which is very interesting, is what happened in Niger just a month ago. Niger was also a colony of France. They are independent, but France maintains a military presence of about 1,600 troops in the country. They also had quite a big influence on the sitting president. So a military coup ousted the sitting president. This is complicated, right? These stories are not easy. Military coup ousts the sitting president. And France says, we're going to use our troops to oust the military coup and put the president back in power. And we're going to call upon ECOWAS, which is kind of like Africa's NATO, to get other African nations to send troops to support us in this. But the people of Niger said, no, we are not a colony of France. You do not get to determine our destiny. Only Niger people get to determine who's going to rule our country. Whether it's a military coup or a president, they get to decide. And they called upon the other citizens of the member states of ECOWAS to get in their streets and tell their governments not to support a military intervention. This was especially important in Nigeria, where the president of Nigeria wanted to send troops into Niger, but the people held mass protests and made it politically inconceivable for the Nigerian president to send troops to Niger. This allowed the time and space for Niger people to surround France's military base with nonviolent protests and maintain those protests until France ultimately withdrew its troops. So these stories are powerful. In 1905, Sweden and Norway were kind of merged together in one country. Long story, won't tell you the whole thing. But they were on the ropes. They were about to break up. And the Norwegians were ready to declare their independence, and the Swedish government and ruling elites were saying, if you do that, we're going to invade and take you back. So the Norwegian workers and the Swedish workers said, no, when this dissolution of our countries happen, there will be no war. If the ruling elites say they're going to war, we, the workers and the unions of workers and the labor parties, we will launch a general strike. Nobody will fight that war. Nobody will work. Nobody will go to school. Nobody will shop. And indeed, when the split happened, the workers made sure that the Swedish ruling elites could not launch a war and take back Norway. If we look at the US, there have been some remarkable campaigns to stop wars. One of the ones that stands out to me is the Pledge of Resistance to US escalation of armed factions in Nicaragua and El Salvador from 1984 to 1990. Many of the people on this call were instrumental in these campaigns. So I hope my little recap can do them justice. But basically, to make this incredible story too short, they organized several prongs of campaigns, one of which was called the Pledge of Resistance, which asked people, if the US escalates the war in Nicaragua, What will you do? Will you do civil disobedience to stop it? And people said yes. They had 40,000 people sign this pledge. And that would have just been a piece of paper, but they said, you know what? If you're going to build muscle, you got to flex them. You got to show the politicians that you're ready to cause havoc with nonviolent struggle if they start war. So every time Congress escalated, every time they inched closer to a full-scale war in Nicaragua, the Pledge of Resistance folks called upon the people to do civil disobedience at the White House, to get arrested, at military training facilities where the paramilitaries were being trained. There was one group of 1,000 people who blockaded a military facility related to this for 2 years. 2 years. Can you imagine? And indeed, they made it impossible for several administrations to escalate this war, first in Nicaragua and then in El Salvador. This is a story that we need to tell more often. One of the things that we see, especially in nonviolent revolutions, is that the risk of violence can be quite high, especially around the power vacuums that can occur. In 1986, during the People Power Revolution in the Philippines, there was a moment when the millions of people in the streets protesting to get the dictator Ferdinand Marcos to leave power and to uphold their democratic election of Corazon Aquino could have descended into a bloodbath. A group of soldiers had mutinied at a military base in the city of Manila, and Ferdinand Marcos had called upon his loyal troops to drive their tanks there and shoot them down, which would have precipitated a civil war because they would have fought back. But fortunately, the People Power movement called upon the people, notably the Catholic nuns, to go into the streets and stop this bloodbath. So imagine this, the Catholic nuns, they get in the street, the tanks are coming towards them, they hold up their cross, they're praying their rosary, they say, in the name of God, stop your tanks right now. The tanks stopped, and the nuns held them and prevented them from reaching the military base, starting a civil war, creating the violent chaos that probably would have squelched this incredible movement. Because they did that, no war happened. The People Power movement succeeded, and they had a democratic government. Lest you think that you need a mass movement to achieve this goal, I want to lift up the story of Stanislav Petrov, because sometimes we are in the right place at the right time to literally save the entire world with an act of civil disobedience. Stanislav Petrov was, the middle-ranking officer in the nuclear facility in Russia when a report came in that the US was firing nuclear weapons at Russia. Petrov said, where's the verification? Somebody needs to verify this. But his superior officers said, no, just fire some nuclear weapons back. We don't have time. Just go bomb the US. Petrov said, no. They said, we're going to court-martial you. Petrov said, no, it's too big a risk. He stopped nuclear war from breaking out in 1983. I was 1 year old in 1983, barely under a year old. If he had not done that action, we all would not be here today having this conversation. Many times the stories of how war is stopped by popular movements or civil society does not get recorded. It doesn't even get noticed. Our history favors the stories of when war breaks out. And it tends to not retell the stories of how we stopped war. In 2017, some of you will remember this really shaky moment where North Korea and Trump were exchanging nuclear threats. And people in the US, North Korea, and South Korea especially rose up against this and said, for heaven's sakes, tone down your language, stop threatening nuclear war, back out of this, and chill out. Because they did that, the madmen in charge did not go into nuclear war. So let's do another check-in. I wonder if there are any of these stories that I've just mentioned that are new to you. Was there one of these stories that you had never heard before? Yes, which ones? If you can put it in there, that would be great. Which ones were new for you? All right, that's more helpful. Yeah, the Russian soldier, the Philippines, Nicaragua, US in 1983, the Sweden-Norway strike. I'm so glad. This is very heartening to hear. Put a lot of time into finding these stories, so it's exciting. Stephen, I saw your question. Where do I find more information? I will send out with the recording a kind of a bibliography of all these stories and where you can read more about them. How about that? Most of them are on this great website called the Global Nonviolent Action Database. Maybe one of my great friends like Peter Burgell or Ken Budigan or David Hartso can get that link in the chat box for everyone. All right. So if you have questions along the way, you can save them up. We will have time for questions in a little bit. So here's a section that I'd love to explore with you. Working to win. So most of these stories have to do with stopping a war, right? How do we stop it at the beginning, the middle, the end? But sometimes it's not enough to just stop a war. Sometimes the threat is to non-negotiables, vulnerable people of your community or the sovereignty of your nation, and you want to help win the cause. Fortunately, nonviolent action can be useful in these cases as well. You can use nonviolent tactics to fight differently, to not have to participate in the violent wing of this war. Surprisingly, because people always ask me, well, what about the Nazis? A lot of the examples we have come from World War II and the resistance to the Nazis. The funny thing is that a lot of populaces under occupation are disarmed. So their option to fight back violently is limited, but their option to fight back non-violently is often less limited and constrained. So coming out of World War II, we are now collecting all these stories of things like how the Berlin wives who had Jewish husbands won the release of their Jewish husbands, or the Danish rescue of the Jews, or the Norwegian teachers' resistance. One story I absolutely love that you can go watch on Netflix, which is wonderful. Many of these have feature films, by the way, which is great. But the resistance banker tells the story of how Dutch bankers funded the resistance movements covertly and funneled millions of dollars into the ways that people were resisting the Nazis. Significantly, they funded the strike fund for the railroad workers who, at the end of World War II, or close to the end, went on strike. Now, the strike was about things like wages and rights and dignity of the workers. But the functional impact of that was that all these supplies that were supposed to go to the Germans at the front in France did not make it there, which lost them several battles and hastened the end of the war. Other stories include things like the rescue of the Jews in Denmark and the Norwegian teachers' defense of education. So when Norway was occupied by the Nazis, one of the things they wanted to do was implement a Nazi curriculum in all the schools. 30,000 Norwegian teachers went on strike against this, were rounded up by the Nazis, put on railroad cars, and sent to a detention center. The people ran to the tracks with bread and blankets and passed them into the teachers in the cars, saving their lives as they went into this frozen detention center. But what this resistance did was it denied the Nazis and the Nazi collaborators a key goal, which was to brainwash the nation's youth. One of the things that we try to do with this set of approaches is to deny occupying forces their goals. These tactics are not just things that peace activists think of. This is a World War II espionage and sabotage manual from the 1940s, the very thing that was circulated to the resistance movements. It includes things like working slowly and to slow down what you're doing so you don't actually finish a job for the Nazis, or contrive as many interruptions as you can, go to the lavatory and spend more time than you need to there, call their telephone numbers with prank calls like, hello, is this the shopping district? Oh, I'm sorry, this is Nazi headquarters. Oh, really? What are the directions to the shopping district? And just go on, taking up all of their time. If we can have an espionage and sabotage manual that includes civil resistance, why can't we have widespread civil resistance manuals that are distributed to the whole populace? One thing that we find in these particular set of stories is that they are often overlooked in the narratives of what won the war or how the war was won. A good example of this happened in the Civil War in the US, when 800,000 enslaved African Americans broke out of slavery by leaving the plantations and heading to Union refugee camps. This is probably a low estimate. This is the actual number from the refugee camps, and there were probably many more. To give you a sense of how big this number is, there were 4 million enslaved African Americans at that time. We know from researchers like Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen that if 3.5% of the populace engages in acts of civil resistance, particularly in non-cooperation or intervention, the struggle will win. In this case, 3.5% of the US population at the time is 1 million people. You can see they're getting very close to that number just with the enslaved African Americans actively resisting slavery. This caused havoc in the South. It punched a hole in their economic system. It caused disruptions to everyday life. And yet we are rarely taught this story about how African Americans fought this war using this tactic. To go back to Algeria for a moment, one of the things that helped bring the end of the Algerian War of Independence and decisively win it for the Algerians was the fact that the French citizens held a massive campaign on behalf of Algeria's independence. They made it politically untenable for the continued occupation of Algeria. These stories can help us in times like these, where we have conflicts where we find ourselves struggling to say, let's just stop the war, just surrender and or have a ceasefire. You know, the tactics of fighting back differently can be something that peace activists actively encourage with people who are engulfed in active cases of war. In the Ukraine, there were many examples of this, and there's undoubtedly still more examples happening. A really good one was this town where they were invaded by the Russians, occupied by the Russians. Their mayor was taken hostage, and the people took to the streets. They went out like you're seeing here. This is them protesting their occupation under Russia. And they stayed in the streets until they had a new agreement with the Russians. The mayor would be released, and the Russians wanted the people to actively to disarm from weapons. They agreed, the Russians left, and the kind of funny thing about this story is that even though they had to disarm from classic weapons like guns, they did not have to disarm from civil resistance. They are fully armed in this picture. They were able to resist Russian occupation using the nonviolent weapons at their disposal. This piece of the field of civil resistance is under-researched and could be much more widely used. So a few key points on using nonviolent tactics amidst war to win the war, to further the cause, to win the struggle if you don't want to win the war. Nonviolent tactics allows us to mobilize the unarmed population. This is especially helpful if your people have been disarmed. It broadens the resistance. Not everybody is able or willing for one reason or another, maybe moral ideology or physical capacity, to pick up a gun and fight back. Almost everyone can fight back differently using nonviolent tactics. This can help populaces achieve the goals held and prized by their people, while denying occupiers and invaders their objectives. There may be some distinctions from peacetime struggles around this. We're often trying to keep the nonviolent movements distinctly separated from violent flanks when we're operating in social justice movements. When a war is going on, you may not have the luxury of that distinction. You may feel that your populace has to support the troops for some reason, or can't openly critique the war effort. It may be directly putting you in a vulnerable situation. So what we see is often concurrent struggles. The thing that we should be aware of, however, is that the risk of repression increases whenever the use of violence is present, whether that's in peacetime or in wartime. So these struggles are often at higher risk of repression. But again, this is an understudied aspect of civil resistance, and it is definitely underestimated in the narratives of what won the wars that we're seeing. The other thing I'd like to mention in the context of a war is raging all around you is this idea of carving out space for peace. Zones of peace, local ceasefires, peace team protection, other strategies provide relief from war and show the potential for peace that can sometimes ignite and hasten the end of a war. Groups like Nonviolent Peace Force operate in hot conflict zones around the world to do civilian protection, to open peace-building conversations, to de-escalate the threat of violence from multiple sides of the conflict, and can play a significant role in actually helping people feel like there is a path out of the violence. Even less formal examples like the Syrian Underground Library can serve this purpose as well. This is literally, people go into the rubble of Aleppo, they go gather up the books that are left, they put them in one place, and people can go to this library to get relief from the constant pressures of war. We also see nonviolent action resolving localized needs, things that are critically important to a smaller group of people in the context of war. In Yemen, there was a situation where two parts of a city used to have their own wells. One well got, the pipeline that would move the water from one well to the other got destroyed. So everyone would go to this one well, which then led to violent conflicts, armed groups causing death to children around the well, and conflicts around who got to access the well. This was considered unresolvable for 30 years. And then a group of women came back to their parts of the city after going to university, gathered the other women who were still there, and pushed for peace talks and negotiations to get the men on board. Now, in their society, it's very unusual for women to enter a public meeting. But the women broke that taboo and they marched into the place where the meeting was being held, and they sat down and they said, men, you cannot leave this room until you come out with a resolution for this water well. And indeed they did. They fixed and repaired the pipeline to the two wells, which helped to reduce the violence in the whole area, as well as, having many other important effects. One of the best examples of carving out space for peace is the Columbia Peace Villages. These were formed in the midst of violent civil war, armed groups, often related around the drug trade. And everyone was supposed to pick a side. Everyone was supposed to be in one of these factions or the other. But this village of San Jose de Arpetiro said, no, we're going to carve out a place where you can just be for peace. Nobody will have any weapons here. And indeed, they defended this against massacres by the other people. They persisted, they rebuilt when their parts of their village were destroyed. And these peace villages set in motion the understanding that peace was even possible. A pathway out of this violence could have a chance, a slim chance of success. So I would love to see you put in the chat box, listening to all these tactics, hearing all these stories, what are some examples of ways of resisting that you could imagine yourself doing? Now, I hope you are never in a situation of war. I hope you never have that happening. Some of you on this call might have already lived through that or might be experiencing that. But when we hear all this plethora of ways of showing up, is there anything you heard that you're like, oh, I might be able to do something like that? Patrick says removing or altering street signs. Yeah, we're going to talk about that one in a little bit too. Marching, participating in a general strike. What else? Women's solidarity, right? Working together, sit-down strikes, refusing to pay taxes for war, boycott, divest, sanctions. Love the idea of being a nuisance. Right, exactly. I love how some of you are sharing stories of things that you have participated in already as well. All right. So how many of you came to this call because you were like, I really want to know about how we end wars. Wars are going on. How do we stop them when they're happening? You can raise your hand. You can put yes in the chat box. Me. All right. Yeah. I had a guess that many of you came to hear that. So I will not disappoint. I will share some stories of that with you. So here we go. Here are the stories of how when a war is dragging on and on, when the fighting has become entrenched, when you would like to speed up the end of the war, here's what some people have done. The best example are the women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. If you have not watched the documentary Pray the Devil Back to Hell, please tonight after you get done with this talk, go stream it, watch it, rent it. It is not an easy watch, but you will leave feeling like if they could do it, who am I to say I can't? Liberia had been enmeshed in a civil war. It had just ended. It had left thousands of people dead. Rape was turned into a tactic of war. It was brutal. Out of this war, the dictator Charles Taylor came to power, which was not necessarily any better. And a rebel flank, a rebel faction said, we don't like this. We're going to start a second civil war and kick you out of power. A woman named Lima Gabowi had a dream. And in the dream, God came to her and said, gather the women and pray for peace. So she woke up and she went to the Muslim women and she went to the Christian women. She said, we must pray for peace, not in our churches, not in our temples. We must go to the street that Charles Taylor drives on every single day and sit in the fish market on the side of the road and pray for peace with signs, with songs, with chants. They did this consistently, persistently. They marched into the places that Charles Taylor was holding events and held their praying for peace in the way of the politicians. They got it to the point where Charles Taylor agreed to hold peace talks with the rebel faction. And they set these up in a neighboring country. And the women of Liberia, Mass Action for Peace, sent a delegation to make sure peace happened. While this is going on, the rebels break the ceasefire. They march on Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. They are like on a path of war and terror, trying to seize the capital while Charles Taylor is out of the country. So as you can imagine, the peace talks are not going too well, but they're of critical importance to stop the basically pillaging of the city. So the women see that the talks are going nowhere. So they go and they sit down in front of the doors and they say, we will not leave. You will not leave until you come out of this with a peace agreement. So the men call the police on them, and the police go to arrest the women. And Lima Gaboe gets up and says, if you lay a finger on me, I will take off all my clothes. Which to those of us from the US are like, what? But in Africa, when a woman, particularly an older woman, threatens to publicly disrobe in front of you, it is the worst curse imaginable. So the guards backed off and they said, okay, you can sit there. And the women sat there and the men couldn't leave. And when they finally made an agreement that stopped the civil war, led to democratic elections, and set the course of the country on a completely different direction. So these things are possible, and they are actually happening more than we think. Another good example happened in Northern Ireland. Yet another intractable, unwinnable, violent conflict between Northern Ireland and Ireland, the British and the Irish, the Catholics and the Protestants. There were mass bombings, shootings, acts of terrorism, and the women predominantly started a movement called the Community of Peace People. And they went into the streets with marches of people, rallies. And you know what? We're not talking 5 people. We're talking weekly marches of 50,000 people. For reference, there are only 1.3 million people in Northern Ireland at the time. 50,000 people in the streets is astonishing. And this movement made a space for the people to say, we are so sick of fighting. We are so tired of fighting. And when they put a referendum up on it, the people of Northern Ireland voted to stop the war and to sign the Good Friday Peace Accords. Stories of peace come from all chapters of human history. And one of the most important stories for us to know about in the United States is the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. This was roughly around 1000 CE. They set this date by native stories and by how they correlate to astrological happenings like eclipses. So it's not an exact date. But basically, some of you will know this is the Iroquois Confederacy, but they prefer the name the Haudenosaunee. 5 nations, lots of fighting and warring between them. And finally, 2 people came, Daganoweda and Hiawatha, and they went from one nation to the next, speaking up for peace, getting each leader to agree to peace until they could assemble all 5 nations to come up with this great law of peace and to literally bury the hatchet beneath the tree that you see in the flag. So if you've ever heard that phrase, bury the hatchet, that's where it comes from. They literally buried the weapons of war. So I'm sure you have all heard of the Christmas Day truce in World War I between France and Germany, when French and German soldiers just stopped fighting on Christmas and went out and smoked cigarettes together, played football together. What you may not have heard is that this threatened the entire war effort. And the next year, the French and German generals threatened to court-martial and execute anyone who participated in these ceasefires because the war was so hated. The soldiers didn't want to fight it. The people despised this war. And what brought this war to an end was not actually a decisive battle one way or the other. What brought it to the end were decisive popular uprisings of workers and people and soldiers. Notably, the Russian Revolution happened, and the people were so against the war and had been against war since the previous war that when the Bolsheviks took power, long story there, but when the Bolsheviks took power, they campaigned on an anti-war stance and pulled Russia out of World War I. But they were not the only people where this happened. The Germans had the High Fleet pulled back from the front of their naval wing. And when they went to redeploy them, the soldiers, the sailors mutinied. They said, we don't want to do this. And they didn't mutiny like they rose up and shot their captains. No, they went on strike. But the ringleaders were rounded up and executed. And in protest of that, all these sailors that you're looking at in this picture marched off the ships and went into the square and went on strike and refused to go fight the war anymore. And that is what led Germany to surrender. So who stopped World War I? People stopped World War I. I want to speak a little bit about East Timor, mainly because of the situation in Gaza right now. Many people are asking, well, what can we do about Israel's bombardment of Gaza? And the reality that this is looking more and more like a genocide. So one of the stories of stopping genocide happened in East Timor when Indonesia was on a rampage against the East Timorese who wanted independence. And there was a genocide going on. And the East Timor independence movement mobilized international solidarity. The picture you're looking at is in Australia, but the piece of this that I want to share is about the US Solidarity Campaign, which organized to get the US politicians to pull our military funding out of Indonesia. They succeeded in doing this. They cut off all military funding to the Suharto regime. 5 months later, President Suharto resigns. Then, I think it's 10 months after that, East Timor has an independence referendum and it passes. And 2 years after we pulled military funding to Indonesia, East Timor gets its full independence. What stopped that genocide was US citizens saying we can no longer let our country be complicit in this. And I think there is a direct parallel to the role and responsibility that we hold in the situation with Israel and Palestine. Even when you think you will not succeed, even when you think these tactics will never work, it is vitally important that you do them. Every time we stand up for peace, we make peace more possible. And this is critically important to, if we don't succeed this time around, maybe we will succeed the next time around. This was true for the Hemland Peace March. It was true for many other campaigns. So never be afraid to stand up for peace, even if you're the only voice it feels like. So I've shared a lot of stories. I'm wondering if there's any story that's coming to your mind that is akin to these that you want to just pop the name of into the chat box, maybe the name and the date. You know I don't have all the stories, but maybe you're thinking about one that you'd like people to even just get a little heads up about. Anything that's coming to mind. Believe me, I'm going to take note of these and they'll get added to my impressive list of stories. Thank you. The Korean Candlelight Revolution. Great example. Okay, I'll let you think more about that as you go on. So I want to just make sure that we turn the whole circle on this continuum of how we stop war. How do we make war less likely? Well, we deny war access to all the things that war needs to succeed. You kick them out of their military bombing ranges, like Vicky's did in Puerto Rico. You kick them out of university campuses where they're doing military research or getting tech resources. You kick them out of the places that they're trying to do NATO maneuvers, like they did in Montenegro. You say that you will not be a participant in their war. You burn your draft card. You move the money. You say every time there's an opportunity to constrain how your government forms its laws around wars, constitutions, military spending, you stand up and say, pull this back. Rein in your war addiction. And then proactively, we also have to build the alternatives. And this is where something called civilian-based defense comes in. This is a theory of national defense that is based on the stories that we've been talking about, but organized into a theory of defense. So this is something that's planned, prepared for, and trained for, just the way that militaries plan for it. It's not an ad hoc struggle. And ideally, just like with the military, it can act as a deterrent. So other countries are afraid to invade you or tangle with you or mess with you because they know that your populace is so able to wage nonviolent struggle against them. And it can thwart not just coups and occupations, but also can maybe serve as a protection for the people against the abuses of ruling elites or against corporations. In this theory, the idea is that you're going to deny aggressors their objectives, you're going to mobilize widespread defiance, you're going to cause maximum problems, you're going to subvert the reliability of their troops, and ultimately you're going to deter and defeat your aggressors. Switzerland integrated it into their defense strategies, which included military planning as well. And they used the metaphor of a hedgehog. The idea was to make their little country so notoriously hard to swallow and prickly that people wouldn't mess with them. I think it's a great image to think about. A good example of this happened in Denmark under Nazi occupation. So the Danes had very little military resistance. They fought for 6 days and then they surrendered to the Nazis. And the Nazis took over everything, but they denied the Nazis key goals like rounding up the Jews, getting unchallenged access to food supplies. One of the cool things that they did was the Nazis wanted to build warships in the Danish shipyards. So the shipyard workers would do things like screw in the bolts really slowly. And when the Nazis weren't looking, they would unscrew the bolts. They were so effective at slowing down the construction of the ships that by the end of 5 years of occupation, they had not built a single warship for the Nazis. This is a form of civilian-based defense. It was also used as a theory when the Soviets invaded the Czechoslovakia in 1968. They had a widespread and robust kind of civil resistance uprising against this, including changing those road signs, like was mentioned in the chat box, including a set of 10 commandments. When a Soviet soldier comes to you, you don't know, you don't care, you don't tell, you don't have, don't know how to, don't give, can't do, don't sell, don't show, do nothing. This campaign was very powerful. The Soviets had an overwhelming military force. They expected to have no problems taking over Czechoslovakia. It soon became clear that while their military had succeeded and was, literally in place all over Czechoslovakia, they could not control the people. Ultimately what transpired was that this did not win a full victory for the Czechoslovakians at that time, but it did win significant concessions from the Soviets and set in motion the knowledge of the people that led to, 20 years later, the Velvet Revolution, which kicked the Soviets out. Now, when I was 20 years old, this seemed like forever, like, oh my God. Now that I'm 41 years old, it seems like nothing. It's like the Iraq War for us was 20-ish years ago. And you really understand and see how the continuity of one struggle can contribute to the success of the next. Lithuania went one step further. After their nonviolent revolution against the Soviets, they put civilian-based defense into their constitution as a form of defensive strategy. They said, wow, this worked for us once. We might as well study it and learn it and make sure everybody knows it. This came in handy about 4 years ago when the US was doing NATO maneuvers on Russia's border, and Russia was getting a little upset about that. And so they were starting to move their troops to the Lithuanian border. What Lithuania did was they reissued their pamphlets on civilian-based defense. And they said something like, if a large nation, Russia, should invade us, here's what we expect our civil servants to do, our teachers to do, our moms and pops to do, our young people to do. This is how you're going to resist any larger nation, Russia, that tries to occupy us. And indeed, they were well prepared, and Russia did not invade them. This theory, putting together all the stuff we've been talking about, gives peace activists something to hang our hats on and say, we have an alternative to this bombing and tanks and endless military spending that we have, and it actually is pretty effective. It also can help us resist corporations. This is true in the case of Quebec, which organized a plan of civilian-based defense as a deterrent to fracking companies that wanted to come in. They made a community-based plan about how they were going to shut down and blockade the roads that the frackers needed, how they were going to keep them from getting access to water, which farmers were going to let the movement camp in their field to uphold the resistance. And then they calculated how many dollars per day they were going to cost the fracking companies. And then they published this information and warned them, especially the investors, if you come into Quebec, this is not going to be an easy moneymaker for you. You're going to lose money here. And indeed, that stopped the fracking companies from coming in. Combined with things like peace teams, we start to see how we can ongoingly plan and prepare for, as peace activists, to pull off these kind of strategies. Badshah Khan famously had an 80,000 person standing army trained in nonviolent resistance. He was a contemporary of Gandhi's. Gandhi also had the Shanti Sena, which would go into places where riots were happening and try to stop the violence from breaking out. This gave rise to many other contemporary examples like Nonviolent Peace Force, the Portland Peace Team, Meta Peace Teams, DC Peace Team, Peace Brigades International, and gives us a living example of what this looks like on the ground. So just to summarize, because you've all been such patient listeners, and I do want to get to some of your questions, what we can do to stop war is to think about organizing now, not just when a new conflict breaks out. There are going to be harder and easier times to stop a war. The harder times are often when the war breaks out, when war fervor is high, when both sides think they're going to get a swift victory. So remember that if you're feeling despair at the height of a start of a conflict, remember that is the hardest time. We can make sure that our friends and colleagues and family members are studying nonviolent struggle and civilian-based defense, kind of like what we've been talking about tonight. And that we know to go beyond protest and plan acts of non-cooperation and intervention. It's important that we understand our leverage points in the conflict. For example, as US citizens, our leverage point is different than a Palestinian, an Israeli, a Ukrainian, a Russian, but it is an important leverage point to push on. No matter what, we can always be supporting anti-war voices, but especially among the aggressors. One of the most important things you can do to stop the war in Ukraine is to support the Russian anti-war movement. They are up against fierce odds, and they need our support. And if you happen to be sitting in the position where your country is being attacked, remember that fighting, quote unquote, with nonviolent tactics is an option. That we don't have to just call for an end to the war, we can actively participate in achieving the goals that are worthy and just, and showing that this can be done with nonviolent tactics. Please remember that peace work is not a popularity contest. You will often be vehemently disliked by every side when you stand up for peace. Until you're not, until you win. Everybody loves Thich Nhat Hanh now, but please remember that he spent most of his life in exile because, he came to the US to speak for peace. And I think it's important to be clear about whether your goal is to end a war versus win a war. That's going to affect your strategy and tactics. And I think we cannot underestimate the importance of working continuously on peace infrastructure, peace culture, and broad-based knowledge. In conclusion, remember that this stuff is not impossible. It has vast potential. More research is needed. And we need to not just research this stuff, but train our people in using it. This is a glimpse of what a comprehensive approach might look like. You've heard a lot of stories tonight. Imagine if someone much smarter than I went out and put it into a whole framework that we could study. And this is a global field. It could be a global effort, right? These are not just stories that the US have pulled off. We're learning from people all over the world. And the most important thing is to take it seriously. As Dr. King said, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. So thank you. If you could answer one more chat box question for me, I would love to hear from you. On that scale of 1 to 10, how possible do you now think it is to resist war with people power? Oh, 11. Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. And you know what? If I haven't convinced you, don't be shy about putting a 3 in there. I will not take that personally. See a lot of 9s and 10s. Great. Yeah, thank you for the 5s and the 7s. If you even come up 1 degree, I think that's a great success. Wonderful. I'm glad these stories had meaning for you in having a sense of what's possible. So we have a few more minutes left, and I'd love to invite your questions. I don't know that I'll have answers for all of them, but if I do, I will certainly share that with you. If you would like to turn on your video and raise your hand, that's fine. If you would like to use your reactions button to raise your digital hand, that would be helpful. And Caitlin, I see your question in the chat box, so let me start with that one. So Caitlin is asking, how do those movements relate to today's culture here in the USA? Great question, Caitlin. Every country is going to be a little bit different, but I think one thing that I see as a commonality between those stories and our country is that in none of these examples was the peace movement enjoying a robust popularity at the start of them, for example. Almost every one of these situations, the military were the heroes of the story, maybe the doomed heroes of the story. But I think we can take a little bit of solidarity and comfort in understanding that every movement that succeeded has done so against some really challenging odds in terms of what the priorities of their country were and who was getting support and what was going on. I think also something else we need to think about is it's not just protests that win these struggles. And we're faced with recalcitrant politicians who are very addicted to war. And we need to remember that we need to non-cooperate and intervene, not just lift our voices. So I see a question from Mary Ryan Hotchkiss that says, how can we reduce the violence in our culture? Great question. We are a very violent culture. In fact, I was just reading some recent reports that was really saying, looking at global conflict and the US, we don't have an official war here domestically, but we are ranked right up with places that do. So I think teaching people de-escalation skills is really important, and every peace team that I've mentioned can help do that. I think teaching people about nonviolent action can actually help them understand that we can achieve social justice without using violence. I think breaking down some of the social isolation is also important. People get stuck in their silos, their rabbit holes, their echo chambers, and that's where the toxic polarity is escalating into violent conflict. And then we can also think about ways that we can provide protective accompaniment for people who are vulnerable and at risk as well. Yes, Tom, I see your hand.
I just want to answer the question. Yes, there is a civilian-based defense manual. Look at the Albert Einstein Institution website in their resources, and you can download that document by Gene Sharp, who is the researcher who came up with that term, and it's a free PDF download.
Great, thank you. I see Patrick's question that what's the first step to pulling off any of these things? I think that's a great question. A lot of these struggles actually were fairly ad hoc in how they came about. Czechoslovakia might be a good example. But I think the aspiration of people in the nonviolent field, in the civil resistance field, is to equip populaces better at this stage of human history. We have all these examples. How do we make sure that people know them, right? If you ask any 5-year-old, show me how you pull out a sword, they're going to draw their weapon. They know that much at least. And do we have the equivalent for the nonviolent movements? I think domestic peace teams are a great place to stop. Start, not stop. But dealing with our violence here in their streets gives us some of the very tools that we might need to deal with, to think in terms of a civilian-based defense. I think organizing campaigns to stop wars or to stop our country's warmongering gives us some of the skills and organizational framework as well. Cher, thank you for your question. Do you have thoughts on non-physical war, psychological, cyber? How do we counter this? Yeah. I have many thoughts, Cher. I'm not sure I have a really cohesive answer for you, but I would say that just as there are tactics that work in the streets, there are tactics that work online. There are tactics that can counter some of the psychological impacts as well. A lot of what we need to do is going to be multi-pronged, just like the ways that militaries are thinking about how they wage struggle. So too do we have to think that way. Two great questions from Betsy. How do we demilitarize our economy? I think there are a lot of divestment campaigns that target the funding that is out there from universities, from investment funds, retirement funds. Anywhere we can move the money out of the military weapons industry, the better. So please get involved in divestment efforts. How do we achieve a ceasefire in Palestine when there's so much misinformation and disagreement about it? I think one of the most important things that we can do as US citizens in particular is to challenge our politicians' stance right now that everything Israel does is justified and cannot be critiqued. That is one of the most important goals that we can hold right now. Calling for a ceasefire is really important. And disrupting day-to-day life until that is achieved is important. Do you see war, mass violence as inevitable to the human species, or is it a learned behavior to believe in a world with no war, genocide? I think that if war was natural to the human species, we wouldn't need to spend $1 trillion on it every year. I think that we actually train our populace to accept war as an inevitable condition. In every war movie that we watch, every video game that we play, every dollar that's spent on the military and military recruitment is all part of the massive propaganda to overcome our reasonable human expectation that this is a crazy idea. So yeah, I don't think it's inevitable. Yes, Tom.
Just that way back in 1940, the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead wrote an essay going exactly to that point, saying that war is a human invention and it's a choice. And she proved that pretty much dispositively by showing the societies, the cultures that never went to war, that don't go to war. If you have those societies, that effectively proves that it's not inevitable.
Yes, we also know from the anthropological record that war only showed up in human history about 12,000 years ago, which seems like a really long time, right? I mean, a minute of war is too long, but in reality, there is a lot of human history, like 2 million years of human species history that predates war. We've been doing peace much longer than this thing called war. And if we're lucky, if we're more than lucky, if we're strategic and organized, we can make this 12,000 year period just a blip on the human timeline. We can understand that it was a mistake and we don't ever want to do it again. So these are great questions in the chat box. David Hartso asks, how can we get the presentation out to millions of people in the US and around the world who are sick of war? We will make sure the recording is readily available, and we encourage you to share it with your newsletters. And we want to thank Tom Hastings and Portland State University for hosting this conversation and making it available to people at this critical moment. Let's see. Great, some very tricky questions about US politicians and US culture. How do we best convince our politicians to stop fueling these conflicts with more aid? I think you need to get in the way of day-to-day life, like the Pledge of Resistance, disrupting, doing civil disobedience, finding out where the specific targets are in the whole operation. You know, people have been blockading ships that were taking weapons to Palestine. They were doing this in the Bay Area, and I think in the Pacific Northwest as well. I think these types of actions are powerful. I think the pray-ins that groups like Jewish Voices for Peace and American Muslims for Palestine have been doing in senators' offices are very powerful. I think, you know, when we talk about how do we get people who are not convinced, looking for these groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, or If Not Now, that give people a space to say unequivocally, we see that there is horrific crimes against humanity happening, and that this has to stop. This behavior is not actually helping Israel either in the long run. So yeah, it's not easy. It is not easy to work for peace. I know I can rattle off all these stories in like their 1 minute nutshell, and it seems like the people rose up and achieved their goals and were happily ever after. The on-the-ground reality of all these stories feels a lot like what you're experiencing right now. Lots of acting, even though people feel like they're in despair. Lots of contentious arguments and debates. Lots of fear that if you stand for peace and nonviolence, you're going to get overrun by the tanks. Lots of frustration that the people who have the power to say, okay, we're just going to stop the bombs, won't do that. If all these people around the world can literally go stand in front of tanks and stop wars from happening, so too can we. Never doubt that you are any different than those nuns in the Philippines, than the people in Czechoslovakia, than the women of Liberia. Their stories should inspire you to live these stories too, and to know that you're not alone, and to see the courage of this lineage that has been handed down from one campaign to the next. This is an incredible inheritance for humanity, and the role of what I do is to make sure we know it here and now. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Tom.
I want to thank you so much, Rivera, and everybody. And I guess the rhetorical question that I want to leave us with is, when we ask, like, what good is this peace movement business when we seem to lose? Well, what if we only stopped one war? Just think about that. One war. Seems to me the peace movement would be well worth everything. Rivera, you've been inspirational. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all of you. Appreciate your comments in the chat box, and we'll see you out there.